Long History's random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 6, Jon Stuart, the favourite. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Welcome to listeners new and old. Each week, we literally pick a Prime Minister at random and then ask a few questions, such as how did the Prime Minister get into office, what did they achieve in office, and how did they leave office. Along the way, we paint a little picture of the times, just to give a bit of context. We've already recorded many of these episodes now, so if you fancy learning about other Prime Ministers, have a look around your podcast provider, or you'll find them all on longhistory.net, our website. Now, today's Prime Minister was in charge between 1762 and 1763, a very short period, and of course at that time it was still the King who was really in charge. And we've called this episode The Favourite, and you'll soon find out why. So here we go with Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 6, Jon Stuart, the favourite. Now this is actually the 37th Prime Minister we've randomly picked here on Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. However, in chronological order, Jon Stuart, also known as the Earl of Bute, was actually the 6th Prime Minister, one of the very early ones. But after covering 37 Prime Ministers now, you'd think there'd be no more surprises left. However, that's far from the case with this Prime Minister, the favourite as we've called him. It's a bit of an ironic title actually, because although he was a favourite in one way, he was actually one of the most vilified and hated Prime Ministers ever, yes, really. And sometimes these Prime Ministers do catch you out. With Lord Palmerston, for example, that's Henry John Temple, the Prime Minister at the height of the Victorian era, we were surprised to find a candidate for the most popular Prime Minister ever, even more popular than Winston Churchill, at least at the actual time of being Prime Minister. Palmerston died just after winning a general election, whereas Churchill, although he was involved in winning the Second World War, of course, he wasn't actually so successful at winning elections. We've created episodes on both those Prime Ministers if you want to hear more. But back to Jon Stuart, and if you think that social media is particularly poisonous today, Jon Stuart shows us that the more things change, the more they stay the same. He was vilified for many reasons, which we'll go into in this episode. The first question we ask about our Prime Ministers is what was he like? And one of the main points of contention with Jon Stuart was that he was Scottish. He was in fact the first ever Scottish Prime Minister, but being Scottish in those days was a much more lively issue, with the Kingdom of Scotland only having formed a union with the Kingdom of England in 1707. Now that's only slightly more than 50 years before Stuart's premiership. So in the ultra-conservative London-based Parliament of the time, he was very much an outsider, from a different country even. Now how did this Scot become a Prime Minister? Find out in this episode. Jon Stuart was apparently quite a handsome man, with the biographies for some reason particularly highlighting his attractive legs. At least one biography states that the vilification of him in the press was undeserved. And we've not been able to find out much about his personality really, but one thing we can say is that eventually he was unable to take the constant criticism. Another key point laid against him was that he had little political experience before he became Prime Minister. The press and his fellow politicians had it in for him. What was the historical background? So here we like to paint a little picture of the times, and the early 1760s were part of a very transformational time for the country. The two most significant issues at the time were the country's involvement in the 7 Years' War, which had begun in 1756. Now there seems to have been lots of wars with similar names, but this one in particular stands out because it's said to have been the first global war. The First World War, we could say, if another war hadn't got that title. And it involved European powers dividing into two sides, one involving Great Britain, Portugal and Prussia, while the other involved France, Austria, Spain, Sweden, and the various states in the Holy Roman Empire taking either side. These nations, in turn, were fighting in the Caribbean and in the Americas over territories that they were claiming for themselves. This war even extended to other colonial hotspots in, for example, the Indian subcontinent. The other transformational change at the time came with the death of George II and the coronation of his grandson. It's significant that it was his grandson, George III. This was a whole new generation, and the new king had no patience with the old politicians. And it was his attempt to reshuffle political allegiances that led directly to John Stuart, that favourite, remember, becoming Prime Minister. Focusing more on the United Kingdom, outside the world of international battles and politics, the 1760s was also a difficult time for the people in the country. There were a number of bad harvests during this decade, leading to some unrest, which added to the decade's lack of stability caused by this new king. The press, and specifically a man called John Wilkes, does seem to have been particularly poisonous at this time. This man's newspaper, called the North Briton, particularly laying into John Stuart. What was happening in the US at the time? Well, of course, the 13 colonies wouldn't declare their independence from Great Britain until 1776, 13 years after John Stuart left the job of Prime Minister. However, American independence was still a very pressing theme at the time. John Stuart's successor as Prime Minister, George Grenville, was the man who would begin the taxation of the colonies, which is generally agreed to be the starting point of the US's march towards independence. The dispute between the French and the British in North America as part of the aforementioned 7 Years' War led to much of North America being ceded to the English. Who could vote during those years? Anyone who's listened to any of the earlier episodes of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, that is, any Prime Minister before 1832, will know the answer to this question already. Great Britain was only in a proto-democracy at the time. Only the landed gentry and the aristocrats could vote at this point, with the king having pretty much the final say over who would become Prime Minister. And this was particularly a significant issue with the premiership of John Stuart. The new king had been crowned in 1760, and he made it clear that he wanted to sweep aside the old guard. This included two very famous early politicians, known as Pitt the Elder and Thomas Pelham Holles. The latter, also known as the Duke of Newcastle, was the Prime Minister before John Stuart. And we'll look at what happened in more detail when we ask, how did John Stuart become Prime Minister? Although there were no official political parties at this time, alliances were formed which were broadly termed the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs had held the most power ever since the first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, but now a new king wanted a change. John Stuart was a Tory, and he was indeed the first Prime Minister from this grouping to take office, showing that politics was fundamentally shifting with the new king. Those Tory and Whig groupings were solidifying, as various factions realised that they'd have more power if they worked together, and that would eventually lead to the two-party system. What was John Stuart's background? He was a specifically Scottish aristocrat, born in Edinburgh in 1713. Like 19 other Prime Ministers, he went to Eton School, but uniquely, he went to study at Leiden's University in today's Netherlands, which gave him an international perspective which would help him during his premiership. In his early 20s, he was chosen to represent Scottish peers in the House of Lords, but the most significant event of his life appears to have taken place around a table playing cards, when he met the Prince of Wales, Prince Frederick, who was the heir to the throne. John Stuart would soon be working for him, but then Frederick died. At the age of 44, he never actually became king, which is why there was this generational leap between grandfather and grandson. By the time of Prince Frederick's death, however, Stuart had become friends with his wife and widow, Princess Augusta, and in turn he became a tutor to Frederick and Augusta's son, who would be the future George III. So his father had died when he was 13 years old, and he actually became king himself at the age of 22. And so John Stuart had been a part of the future George III's life during all 9 of those formative years. Stuart's closeness to Princess Augusta did lead to some scandalous rumours, but the biographies we've read suggest that Stuart's active religiousness and his denouncement of adultery mean that it was unlikely that the rumours were true, and not least because he was actually happily and productively married. He married Mary Wortley Montagu in 1736 when he was 23 years old, and actually went on to have 11 children with her. So it's questionable whether he would even have time to have an affair. How did John Stuart become Prime Minister? Well, we've alluded to it already, and this is the most controversial point of all about John Stuart, and the reason he was quite so vilified during his time as Prime Minister. Now let's be clear, many aristocrats at that time got the job of Prime Minister because they were well connected, but in the case of John Stuart, this was blatantly obvious. He didn't have much experience in politics, and he was put in place specifically because he wasn't part of the old guard. As we've said, it didn't help that he was an outsider, being Scottish, and he had only got where he was because he was George III's favourite. It's not very hard to imagine the young, perhaps naive king thinking that his wise tutor could be the man to solve the country's problems and take it in a new direction, not really worrying about the details and how other people would react to this imposition. The previous administration had been something of a coalition, with this Thomas Pelham Holles, the Duke of Newcastle, being the previous Prime Minister, but William Pitt the Elder being his close second. And it's perhaps worth adding, the definitions and titles of posts in government in those days were quite different. When George III ascended to the throne, Pitt the Elder soon resigned in October 1760. Apparently this was particularly because Stuart was pressing for an end to the 7 Years' War. In May 1762, Thomas Pelham Holles, the Duke of Newcastle, then resigned, and by that time John Stuart was already Prime Minister in all but name. What were John Stuart's biggest achievements as Prime Minister? Despite being vilified and hated, the biographies are actually quite positive about Stuart and say that he was an underrated Prime Minister. After all, the 7 Years' War did end under his watch, and ending a war has raised many Prime Ministers' profiles over the years. Not least those two Prime Ministers we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, Henry John Temple, Lord Palmerston as he was known, who was there as the Crimean War ended, and Winston Churchill of course. But despite being around at the end of the 7 Years' War, he didn't really seem to gain much credit for it. Pitt the Elder severely criticised the terms of the peace, and he'd been around for most of the war, and he was perhaps the one whose reputation most benefited from a role in this war. Nevertheless, John Stuart did bring it to an end, and it was his international education that helped him out when negotiating the treaty that would end the war. And although he was criticised at the time, the British actually came out quite well in the negotiations, for example gaining much of French Canada. What led to John Stuart leaving the job of Prime Minister? Well, he didn't really have time to settle into the job, only being in the post for 10 or 11 months. Why he left was because of all the aforementioned reasons, really. He was Scottish and seen as an outsider, he was too close to the king who had given him the job, there were those rumours that he'd had an affair with the king's mother, he'd caused the resignation of two political stalwarts, Pitt the Elder and Thomas Pelham Holles, he didn't manage to gain any credit for ending the 7 Years' War, and was criticised for capitulating to the French, even though, as we've said, the terms were actually quite favourable to the British. A key point perhaps was that the press was decidedly against him, in particular this John Wilkes in his paper The North Briton. With this tide of vilification, all it needed was a straw to break the camel's back, and that came when John Stuart, in an attempt to balance the books, brought in a highly unpopular tax on cider. He's not the first Prime Minister to lose the job because of tax, but this one didn't seem a particularly major issue. But the constant vilification increased to the point where John Stuart could no longer tolerate it. He resigned, and the king accepted. And he seemed to realise that this experiment with his former tutor hadn't really achieved anything, so he looked to the old guard once again to replace him, George Grenville. Haha, but that premiership would also be quite short. And as we've said, he's the man who would create a tax himself that would lead to US independence. So, why should we remember John Stuart? His influence for the king remained even after he left the job as Prime Minister, something which particularly annoyed George Grenville, Stuart's successor as Prime Minister, and eventually led to his resignation. Overall, Stuart is perhaps best remembered as the first Prime Minister proper during George III's reign, albeit only because he was a favourite of the new king. These are important details because, by the same token, he was the first PM to set the unstable 1760s in motion. We've mentioned Grenville, but Stuart was actually the first of 5 brief premierships, which could be said to have had a significant influence on that reason why the US would eventually declare its independence. Great Britain, frankly, was looking like a little bit of a basket case. And although US independence isn't down to John Stuart alone, it's easy to see how a controversial Prime Minister only in office because he's a king's favourite couldn't go across well in the formative years of a country fighting for its existence. Thank you for listening, everyone, to this episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. This one caught me by surprise, actually, particularly because I don't think there's been any other Prime Minister who's been quite so openly hated. He just doesn't seem to have been popular with anyone at all, hence the reason why he was in the office for such a short time. So if you've liked this episode, please do give it a like before you move on, it's always appreciated, and please share this episode with anyone who might be interested. But above all, thank you for listening to this episode. This was Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 6, John Stuart, the favourite. Goodbye.